Now the radical left is trashing certain members of the Supreme Court who apparently support slavery and internment, whose names will go down in history among the worst. That is the position of Keith Ellison, Farrakhan's buddy. That is the position of a senator from Hawaii. Her name is Hirano. That is the position of Little Dick Durbin of Illinois and scores of others in the Democrat Party and in Hollywood. Two big opinions today, but let's take one at a time and take our time and go through them. But before we do, as is my wont, there was a book many years ago written by, another book, Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Some people read websites, I read books. And the title is The Disuniting of America, Reflections on a Multicultural Society. Now, I've referenced this book before. It was written some time ago, but that's what makes it so compelling in many respects. It was first published in 1991. Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., the son of Arthur Schlesinger, both fairly radical progressives. Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. was a professor, an associate professor at Harvard. But even more, he was a very important advisor to the Kennedy family, specifically John Kennedy. John Kennedy, senator, and John Kennedy, president. And so it's important to remember what Democrats used to say and used to think. And he pointed out a number of things that are very, very important about immigration. And this, again, was the early 90s. He says the classification of all Americans according to ethnic and racial criteria. He says, while the ethnic interpretation of American history, like the economic interpretation, is valid and illuminating up to a point, that is the ethnic classification, it is fatally misleading and wrong when presented as the whole picture. The ethnic interpretation reverses the historic theory of America as one people, the theory that has thus far managed to keep American society whole. Instead of a transformative nation with an identity all its own, America, in this new light, is seen as preservative of diverse alien identities. Instead of a nation composed of individuals making their own unhampered choices, America increasingly sees itself as composed of groups, more or less, in their ethnic character. The multi-ethnic dogma abandons historic purposes, replacing assimilation by fragmentation, integration by separatism. It belittles the unum and glorifies the pluribus. Remember, this is a liberal. The historic idea of a unifying American identity is now in peril in many arenas, in our politics, our voluntary organizations, our churches, our language. And in no arena is the rejection of an overriding national identity more crucial than in our system of education. And he goes on. The militants of ethnicity now contend that a main objective of public education should be the protection, strengthening, celebration, and perpetuation of ethnic origins and identities. Separatism, however, nourishes prejudices, magnifies differences, and stirs antagonisms. The consequent increase in ethnic and racial conflict lies behind the hullabaloo over multiculturalism and political correctness, over the inequities of the Eurocentric curriculum, and over the notion that history and literature should be taught not as intellectual disciplines, but as therapies, whose function is to raise minority self-esteem. Watching ethnic conflict tear one nation after another apart, one cannot look with complacency at proposals to divide the United States into distinct and immutable ethnic and racial communities, each taught to cherish its own apartness from the rest. One wonders, will the center hold, or will the melting pot give way to the Tower of Babel? He says the impact of ethnic and racial pressures on our public schools is troubling. The bonds of national cohesion are sufficiently fragile already. Public education should aim to strengthen those bonds, not to weaken them. If separateness or separatist tendencies go on unchecked. The result can be the fragmentation, resegregation, and tribalization of American life. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., liberal, Democrat, advisor to the Kennedys, especially John Kennedy. Another Harvard professor, also who has passed, Samuel P. Huntington. I've talked about him before. And he wrote in his great book, Who Are We? The Challenges to America's National Identity. And he said, historically, America has been a nation of immigration and assimilation. And assimilation has meant Americanization. Now, however, immigrants are different. The institutions and processes related to assimilation are different. And most importantly, America is different. The great American success story may face an uncertain future. Assimilation of current immigrants is likely to be slower, less complete, and different from the assimilation of earlier immigrants. Assimilation no longer necessarily means Americanization. I'm afraid he's right. And he wrote this book over a decade ago. And it is a fabulous book as well. He said, until the late 19th century, those who chose to cross the Atlantic usually had to undergo long waits at embarkation ports, voyages of more than a month, often incredibly crowded and unsanitary conditions aboard ship. Up to 17% of those who left Europe died on the crossing. Steamships made the passage shorter, safer, more predictable. But immigrants still had to risk the possibility that they would be among the 15% or so who were turned back at Ellis Island. Now, I point this out because there was a host on CBS Morning Show who said the Statue of Liberty, that she must be crying, Lady Liberty. No, Lady Liberty turned back 15% of those who got to Lady Liberty. Those who chose to cross the Atlantic had to have the energy, ambition, initiative, and willingness to take risks, to confront uncertainty and the unknown, to suffer the substantial emotional, fiscal, and physical costs of difficult travel, and to attempt to establish a better life for themselves in a far-off land about which they had little reliable information. The vast majority of the people in their societies who did not migrate either lacked these qualities or turned their talents and energies to other goals. And he explains more, of course. But he points out, and he cites Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., that these immigrants, quote, yearned to become Americans. Their goals were escape, deliverance, and assimilation. And he points out there's a lot less of that today. And there is a lot less of that today. And we have politicians today who reject everything I just read to you, because they, in many cases, are products of balkanization. They believe the future of the Democrat Party is tribalism and balkanization, the cobbling together of minority groups, whether it be ethnic, religious, racial, whatever it is. And that has become what we call the Democrat Party. Not a united America, a balkanized, tribalized America. And this is why they take the position that they do. And so they're trashing the Supreme Court, trashing Supreme Court justices. Now, look, that's okay, but they're the ones who have been horrified when people criticize the court system because they've controlled it for so long. Now, when we return this decision by the Supreme Court, upheld the final executive order of the President of the United States. Most of those lower court judges in the Ninth Circuit were reversed by the Supreme Court today. Donald Trump was right. Donald Trump's lawyers were right. Donald Trump was right about the Constitution. Donald Trump was right about statutory law. Donald Trump was right about the power of the presidency when it comes to immigration and the delegation of authority from Congress to the president. Plenary power. And he exercised that power constitutionally. He exercised that power within statutory law. And for months, he was chastised. For months, he was attacked. So were his lawyers. And I am certain that none of these so-called media outlets, that is the pseudo-media, or print corrections or give vocal corrections for the way they treated him and his lawyers and his administration, who were in fact upholding the rule of law and the Constitution. The problem is, of course, as we've talked about at length, the pseudo-media is just that. It is progressives dressed up as reporters. The court ruled in the immigration case, as we suspected it would or should anyway, that the president had the authority to identify certain countries from which we would not accept refugees or immigrants for a period of time because these countries had dysfunctional governments. Some of them were at war with themselves, had civil wars taking place. Others had no competent ability to determine what individual was doing what. And, of course, that would make it almost impossible for our own immigration services to determine who these people were and what their backgrounds were. And as for predominantly Muslim countries, the Muslim countries with the largest Muslim populations weren't even on the list. We've talked about this before. It left out 92% of the world's Muslims. 92%. So the court said even facially, there's no racism or discrimination per se in this executive order. And all these arguments about Donald Trump's comments during the campaign and tweets, the court said, have absolutely no relationship whatsoever to the executive order. None. And the banning of Syrian migration, was okay under the circumstances, the court said. And so, also, the president was delegated authority by Congress, plenary authority, to act in this area of immigration. And so, the concern by the majority, in the case, the majority decision was written by the Chief Justice Roberts, but there was an excellent concurring decision, of course, by Thomas, who writes beautifully and brilliantly. And they also said, what is the court going to do now? Oversee every instance in which a president makes a decision about immigration? And how is the court qualified to do that? Military decisions, geopolitical decisions, national security decisions, economic decisions. The court, the lawyers on the court, are not qualified. They're not capable to make these decisions in lieu of a president of the United States, nor do they have the authority to do so. Now, the minority on the court went nuts. They went full Maxine Waters. Full Maxine Waters. Now, Sotomayor wrote that this was akin to Japanese internment. How is this akin to Japanese internment when these people aren't even in the country yet? This extra-constitutional, extraterritorial conference of rights on people who don't even live in the country and haven't even set foot in the country yet is insane. And to compare it to Japanese internment camps, there's no internment taking place. None. I've never been impressed with Sotomayor. I told you when she was nominated, she's a left-wing radical, that her opinions as a circuit judge were quite weak, and they continue to be. She's a politician on the Supreme Court. That's what she is. Just like Ruth Bader Ginsburg is an ACLU general counsel on the Supreme Court, and she never fails to demonstrate it. She threw in with this idea that, yes, this was racially motivated and, and it's discriminatory and so forth and so on. The facts don't matter. The facts don't matter. Even though 92% of Muslims in various countries and so forth aren't even covered by the executive order. They're not even covered because those countries aren't covered. Doesn't matter. And so you get reactions from people like Keith Ellison, the deputy chairman, or at least he was, of the DNC, long, hateful record of bigotry, in my view, against Jews. Long. And his association with Farrakhan, which he attempts to dumb down now. But here's what he said on CNN today. Cut 2, go.
Our country has gone through some ugly days. I mean, the Supreme Court in the 1850s said that it was okay to own a black person. That was the Dred Scott decision. That decision hit the dustbin of history. So did Plessy versus Ferguson. So did Korematsu. And this one will, too. I'm telling you, discrimination and racism and hatred and religious bigotry is never going to be winning in the end.
So let's stop here for now. Dred Scott was a decision. Taney was a racist. He was from South Carolina. He was a well-known Democrat that upheld slavery, effectively, and treated slaves as property and said they didn't even have standing to bring the case in the first place. Dred Scott did. What does this have to do with anything? Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal is equal. That was at the end of the 19th century. What does that have to do with the policy that Trump put in place? Korematsu, the Japanese internment case, what does that have to do with the order Trump put in place? In fact, the order Trump put in place was very similar, almost identical to an order that Barack Obama had put in place. But of course, Obama, again, escaped scrutiny by the ilk and the likes of a Keith Ellison. I've got more. We'll be right back. So the Supreme Court did nothing exceptional, although today it is exceptional to hold up the Constitution. But the left, which hates the Constitution, claims the Supreme Court's wrong about the Constitution because they don't agree with what the Supreme Court did. Here's Keith Ellison again. Cut 2, CNN Today. Go.
Our country has gone through some ugly days. I mean, the Supreme Court in the 1850s said that it was okay to own a black person. That was the Dred Scott decision. That decision hit the dustbin of history. So did Plessy versus Ferguson. So did Korematsu. And this one will, too. I'm telling you, discrimination and racism and hatred and religious bigotry is never going to be winning in the end.
They're saying that it is squarely, whether you like it or not, essentially, is what they're saying, it is squarely within the president's authority. And you saying what?
It is not within the president's authority to discriminate on the basis of
Now let's
religion.
stop. First of all, he didn't discriminate on the basis of religion. Once again, 92% of the Muslims on the planet were not covered by the president's executive order. Number 2, let's make up a religion. If there's a religion called, what should we call it? Let's call it the Green Team. The Green Team, just for argument's sake. And I'm not talking about Muslims or Jews or Christians or Buddhists, just the Green Team. And if it turns out the Green Team is responsible for the vast majority of terrorism or whatever in the world, then in fact I would argue the president could say nobody from the Green Team can come into the country. Not while we're in a state of war, not while we're under attack, so forth and so on. But this president didn't do that, did he? He specifically left off the list the largest Muslim majority countries. So what is it that Keith Ellison is doing and saying? Keith Ellison is a race baiter, and I would argue a bigot, long-standing, using Farrakhan-like propaganda. More and more, these are the talking points of the left. More and more, these are the talking points of the Democrat Party. They won't debate the actual substance of what the Supreme Court did. They won't discuss the actual decision. Instead, they have to racialize it. Racialize it. There is no discrimination here. No discrimination here. None whatsoever. Go ahead.
It simply isn't. And the fact that he slapped a few pieces of language on there and threw in a few other countries as an afterthought doesn't correct the fundamental and original flaw.
Say this, he threw in a few other countries as an afterthought. That's not what happened. He didn't throw in a few other countries as an afterthought. He dropped one country. He dropped one country. The Democrat Party needs hate, needs race, needs all the hottest of hot-button issues to get out its vote, to cobble together a majority from various balkanized minorities. Don't blame me. This is what the Democrat Party has become, and this is what the Democrat Party is doing to our country. And I might say, the fact that CNN takes this Keith Ellison, with his well-known, long public record of hate and bigotry, and pushes him out there to comment on the Supreme Court, is really incredible. It's incredible. But look at who CNN embraces. Look at who the Democrats embraced as their deputy chairman, almost the chairman of the DNC. Go ahead.
Said in one of his opening statements in his campaign, he wanted a complete and total ban on Muslim entry into the country.
But that's not what he did in the executive order, is it? Keith Ellison, further on CNN today, targeting Justice Gorsuch. Cut 3, go.
I say that a gloating braggart is not going to win at the end of the day. I say that,
By the way, they say Trump won, which is true technically, but the American people won. This decision was a decision for the American people, American sovereignty, American safety, and national security. It was a great decision for the country, which is why Ellison and his ilk in the Democrat Party and on the left hate it and are in the smear attack mode. Go ahead.
He has his Supreme Court tailor-made to his ugly philosophy, this partisan court.
So the Supreme Court is tailor-made to Trump's ugly philosophy. So now they are trying to smear the Supreme Court as racist. Now just think about this. Over the last few days, they've been full guttural attacks on Trump, the people around Trump, all of you who supported and voted for Trump, now Supreme Court justices who upheld the Constitution, all racists. All racists. Go ahead.
Really should not be on the Supreme Court. In my view, he may be there, but he's not there properly.
So Gorsuch is not on the court properly now. Hillary Clinton the other day trashing the Electoral College. Electoral College is a throwback. Got to get rid of it. Gorsuch isn't on the Supreme Court legitimately. Secretary Nielsen over at DHS, she needs to resign for upholding the immigration laws. These people are anarchists and Marxists. I'm telling you. This is who they are. Go ahead.
You can do that. I mean, in this, you can jam in a Supreme Court by denying a sitting president their right to appoint this Supreme Court justice. That is exactly what happened. And Gorsuch has just done what his paymasters sent him there to do.
And paymasters. Oh, that's an interesting term. Paymasters? So Gorsuch is on the payroll of somebody? Paymasters? Mr. Ellison is a clown. He's a buffoon. He's a bigot. He's a demagogue. And Mr. Ellison, you are more than welcome on this program to debate me. Mr. Producer, I'm not kidding. You reach out to Mr. Ellison and tell him, come on the program, let's have a discussion about this decision by the Supreme Court. Not a kiss-up interview by CNN. Come on a real show, or you'll be questioned. Go ahead.
So it's a shame, but I just know and have deep faith that the best impulses of this country are about liberty, are about equality, are about religious.
You are a thoroughly screwed up man. Thoroughly screwed up. talk about liberty and equality. You wouldn't know it. It punched you in the nose. Then we have Senator Mazie Hirono, who I've come to really detest. She's another race baiter. She's from Hawaii. And here's what she had to say about the Supreme Court upholding the Constitution and the president's authority when it comes to immigration. By the way, notice they never attacked the Supreme Court when it empowered Obama respecting immigration. But here she goes. Cut 4, go.
The president can pretty much do whatever he wants to discriminate against groups of people and say this is for national security.
Is that what the court ruled? That the president can discriminate against groups of people and just say it's for national security? Did she read the opinion? Or is she just spewing her hate and propaganda? It's the latter. That's not what the court said. It's not what the president did. Go ahead.
Ignored all of the comments that the president had made that he had every intention of banning Muslims from our country.
But he hasn't banned Muslims from our country. For the third time, 92% of the Muslims on the planet were unaffected by the president's executive order. The countries that were affected, that were majority Muslim, are countries in name only. They have civil wars. They have destroyed the civil society such as they were. They don't have the capacity to track down their citizens. It's almost impossible for us to know who's coming here. You know, I've often thought of writing I better not say this. Think about this. What if our country really was ruled by Keith Ellison and Mazie Hirono? Just look at immigration. People from war-torn countries, from countries that spread terrorism, where we cannot properly vet them, would be free to come into this country. Adults who bring children into this country, whether they're their own children or not, will be free to enter the country without detention. Just think about this. 20, 30 million people who are here illegally would be granted citizenship. I mean, if you really go down the list of what the Democrats believe in and where they stand, you think about this. What this country would be. Go ahead.
So there are no checks and balances. And in fact, the court is saying if you don't like our interpretation of the Immigration and Nationality Act, then you, Congress, should fix it. But do you think this Congress is going to fix it?
Well, this Congress isn't going to fix it the way you want to. But it's not the court's job to regurgitate what you, a radical left-wing kook, demand of the country. That's not the court's job. Court's, in this case at least, trying to uphold the Constitution, something you refuse to do. Go ahead.
Pass comprehensive immigration reform out of the House. So where are the checks and balances? Not to mention, all you have to do is look at the picture that was tweeted out by Mitch McConnell showing him shaking Justice Gorsuch's hand. Gorsuch gave this court...
Shaking Justice Gorsuch's hand? And that's evidence of what? Senator Hirono? Go ahead.
Vote necessary for this decision. And I say, who's going to be next? Is the president going to issue an executive order against Mexicans? Is he going to issue executive orders against people coming
Here we go with the hysteria and the fear-mongering. The hysteria and the fear-mongering. Go ahead.
Guatemala? What's next? And this is the concern that I had raised when this case was first heard. I said this is such an anti-immigrant president. If the court...
Anti-immigrant president? He's proposing legalizing 1.8 million people who came here before 2007 as children. Obama's DACA covers 700,000 to 800,000 people. Obama never suggested legalizing permanently and setting them on a path to citizenship to 700,000 to 800,000. And Trump jumps out of the box very wrongly, in my view, and proposes that 1.8 million, including those who didn't sign up as DACA, would receive eventually citizenship. Now, does that sound like an anti-immigrant president to you? Or was Obama the anti-immigrant president? Go ahead.
Go behind the bald-faced assertion of executive powers, then who's going to be next? And, I think the case, Korematsu case, and the decision to intern 120,000 Japanese Americans on the basis of national security, I think it's an apt analogy.
And how is it an apt analogy? It was Japanese Americans and Americans of Japanese descent. How is that an apt analogy? These are people who were in the country as citizens and others who were here legally. We're talking about people who haven't even come into the country yet. This is the second one to bring this up. Is she a complete and utter buffoon, or is she a complete and utter propagandist? She's a propagandist. So they throw around Japanese internment anytime you want to enforce the rule of law, whether it's the Constitution or a specific immigration statute. It's like the Japanese internment. But as I said before, the Democrats are experts on Japanese internment since they did it. Since they did it. And their party's expert on slavery since their party defended it during the Civil War. And their party is expert on segregation and Jim Crow laws since their party instituted it. We don't need any lectures from these people. The Supreme Court upheld the Constitution. Barely. 5-4 decision. One justice going the other way, all of a sudden, our historic precedent when it comes to the authority of the federal government to determine who can and cannot come here would have been turned on its head. They are furious that they do not control the presidency, and they are furious that they didn't get a fifth vote for their radical position. But make no mistake about it, the Constitution was upheld today. Muslims were not discriminated against. Meanwhile, the Democrats go off on their allegations of racism against Trump, against the people around Trump, against the tens of millions of people who voted for Trump. And now, the paymasters on the Supreme Court. Racists all, you know. Paul, Long Island, New York, the great WABC. Go.
Well, congratulations on the Radio Hall of Fame induction. Very well deserved, my brother.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.
Mark, with respect to the travel ban decision and the left's, rhetoric on how it's a racist motivation of being anti-Muslim, I would make the argument that today's decision, in fact, protects American Muslims. I believe it accomplishes this by two means. The first, by Muslim American citizens being victims of a terror attack. And secondly, it can prevent animosity and harassment towards American Muslims by those who would blame all Muslims for being responsible for a terrorist attack.
Well, it's a good point. Your point being, look, Muslims get killed in terrorist attacks too. Correct?
Absolutely. Look at, after 9/11, there were Muslims that died in 9/11,
All right, my friend, I appreciate your call. He's quite right. It's a great point, actually. All right, let's continue. All right, I'm trying to get my call screen up here. Here we go. Chelsea, Paramus, New Jersey, the great WABC. Go.
Hey, Mark, thanks for taking my call.
Home of the famous Paramus Mall.
That's correct.
Where my wife once had a job many years ago.
I think that's where we all started.
Not me. I'm from Philadelphia, but thank you anyway.
I'm a recovering progressive myself.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, why couldn't George Bush get a Muslim ban in place after 9/11? I think he would have had the support of the left and the right to do such a thing.
Do you mean a ban from certain countries or an actual Muslim ban?
Well, I mean, I would say a Muslim ban, because at the heart, that's what this seems to be.
It's not. If it were a Muslim ban, then we wouldn't, exclude 92% of the Muslims from the rest of the world.
True.
But look, I can't really explain what George Bush did or didn't do, quite frankly. But I'm sure the Never-Trumpers, many of them who come out of the Bush camp, I'm sure they'd be happy to call in and explain it.
Yeah.
All right, my friend.
Sounds good. Thanks for taking my call.
Be well. We'll be right back.
Mark Levin.